Good morning, everyone. I hope you're well this morning, wherever you are this morning. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar, the Competitive Intelligence Toolkit SWOT Analysis. I'm your host and moderator this morning. My name is Joanna Park-Tonks, and I'm delighted to bring you this webinar featuring the legendary Arthur Weiss, competitive intelligence expert. And it's also proudly sponsored by Aurora WDC. So a special shout out and thanks to Eric and Derek for making this possible today. This webinar is part of a broader series of webinars brought to you by the SLA CI community. If you like what you see today, there's plenty more if you join us for the virtual SLA annual conference, which we'll be telling you about later. I know that the team is planning a fantastic lineup of presentations for the virtual annual conference, so we really hope very much that you will take part in August. The community is trying to shine a spotlight on its membership, and we'd really love to take this opportunity to get to know you better, to connect with you, to understand your informational requirements and needs. So our cunning team have asked us to ask you how we can best assist you, and we would be delighted if you would share your stories. Perhaps if you could drop us some information in the chat below, telling us about how the CIC has added value to your professional life. Maybe any special requests that you have for membership, webinar topics, key insights or takeaways that have helped you, or any advice. So really, as you know, any membership organization is only as strong as its members. So please do reach out to us and share with us any thoughts that you have about how we can improve our offering to you, as together we're stronger. So moving to the next slide. Thank you. I would like to give you a couple dates for your diary. Sorry, I think you've gone too fast. Thank you. So as I mentioned in my intro, registration is open for the SLA 2021 conference. Of course, it's going to be virtual this year. The dates for your diary are August the 4th till the 13th. And there's a really great lineup. In fact, our speaker today, Arthur Weiss, has 2 sessions, 2 keynotes. So another great reason to attend the conference. So again, the link is in the chat below, so you can learn more about this and also save the date. Another date for your diary coming up is June 30th, slightly closer. So this will feature the speaker, Mr. Michael Hill, who is delving into the subject of researching venture capital and really demystifying this topic for our members. It should prove to be a really fascinating webinar, and I urge you to take note and sign up for this. Again, link below in the chat. I'll probably be saying that quite a few times this morning. So moving to the next slide, please. Thank you. Just a brief flavour of what some of the attendees of our previous webinars have been kind enough to share with us. As you can see here, one attendee said it was allegedly the best webinar he'd attended in the last 22 years, with really clear and on-point detailed tips and analysis with just the right amount of detail. So it's very much our quest to provide you with actionable insight and intelligence. So in recognition of your kindness in attending the webinar today, we would like to make a small gesture of thanks, and there will be a prize which will be randomly appointed to one of the attendees today, which will be a prize of $25, which will be sent to you by email if you're lucky enough to win. So that's another great reason to stay till the end, not only to listen to all of the nuggets of information which Arthur has to impart later on. So moving to the next slide, please. So in essence, we're trying to build a community, and that's at the very heart of what we're trying to achieve today. Not only are we trying to scope your requirements and listen very carefully to this, and also spotlighting members, perhaps through the newsletter in weeks and months to come, which is currently in progress. We very much encourage the live tweeting today. So if there's something you agree with, if there's something you disagree with, you know, the more debate, the better. Let's keep the conversation going and continue tweetable moments, teachable insights on Twitter today. The hashtag is CIC webinar, so look forward to seeing you there. I know that Arthur is a very active tweeter, so I'm sure you enjoy following him as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our wonderful speaker today, really one of the pillars of the competitive intelligence community. Arthur is based in London, UK, where he is the managing director of the consultancy Aware, which specialises not only in competitive analysis and research, but also training. Arthur travels all over the world, conducting seminars, webinars, corporate trainings. And what makes Arthur so unique is that he manages to elicit information where other people draw blanks. And I never cease to be amazed by the arsenal that he has in his artillery. He's also cognizant that Generation Z is now coming up to maturity. This is a generation who've been imbibing these technologies almost with the mother milk. And so Arthur is constantly looking for new innovations in this field, tools and techniques to promote the understanding of competitive intelligence, not just as a static methodology, but something which is very much an evolution. Arthur is a long-standing member of the SLA and has a number of different industry affiliations, amongst which the Association of Independent Information Professionals, also the Chartered Institute of Marketing, and we're absolutely thrilled and delighted that he's with us today. A personal disclaimer, I've known Arthur since 2006. I was lucky enough when I was starting out in CI that he was kind enough to help me. I think everyone in their career needs what I affectionately call an angel, and Arthur was definitely one of them. In asking him how he'd like to be described today in this introduction, he shared with me on WhatsApp his characteristic humour, and if you forgive me, I'd like to share it with everyone, Arthur. I quote, "Basically, I'm a mild-mannered, spectacle-wearing nerd who is a bit like Clark Kent, but would prefer to be Superman, except I know that won't fly. Although I do have X-ray vision when it comes to finding information online. As an independent consultant, I don't have a boss to supervise me, but I do have supervision when it comes to finding CI." Take it away, Arthur.
Okay, thank you very much, Jo. As Jo said, we've known each other for a long time, and Jo is a fabulous person. She does less CI now, but that's still very much some of the things that she's interested in. She's now in a completely different area, in sort of diamonds, but not the sort of diamonds that you mine and that have ethical problems, but in manufactured diamonds. And that's a completely different story, but it shows under the lesson there that even something that's a raw material sometimes can get competition, and you can get new sectors that you wouldn't normally expect. But let's move on. I wasn't sure what to call this, whether it was CI Toolkit SWOT analysis, or let's SWOT up on SWOT, or as you'll see from the very beginning, let's just SWOT away. So you can choose your title, but I guess CI Toolkit SWOT analysis is the easiest. So what is SWOT analysis? Well, most of you will know that it's basically an examination of strengths and weaknesses and matching that to opportunities and threats. It should give you a structured assessment of the fit between what an organization can do, in other words, their strengths, can't do, their weaknesses, and the environmental conditions working for and against it, so opportunities and threats. Unfortunately, often doesn't. It's a tool that's historically difficult to identify where it came from. Some people will say that it's from somebody called Ken Andrews, but the actual origins, it's kind of difficult. Nobody really knows for certain. And the problem with SWOT is how it's done. So let's move. The typical way SWOT analysis is done is you'll take hopefully a large piece of paper and you do a 2x2 grid on it. On one side, you've got strengths and opportunities. On the other side, you've got weaknesses and threats. And you'll brainstorm what goes in each of those boxes. So if you've got a team meeting, let's do our SWOT analysis. You'll go around the room. John, give us a strength. Joan, give us another strength. Rupert, a third one. And by the time you've got round the room, you're kind of stuck because the other people have thought all the strengths already, and you've got to say something. The restrooms are particularly clean, so we've got good cleaning staff, or something really stupid, because you've got to give a strength. So brainstorming isn't really a very effective way. Something else that goes wrong is people confuse a strength with a benefit and a feature. And I'll come back to what I mean by strengths, benefits, and features shortly. And then, of course, you summarize it with bullet points. But there's another way of viewing it. A short video illustrates how you can, or maybe you can't, do SWOT.
We can begin the review of the SWOT analysis with the strengths. After gathering input from the team, we came up with 37 strengths. This may seem like a lot considering we're dead last in market share and haven't had a profitable quarter since parachute pants were hot, but we actually whittled it down from 54. Some of the key strengths that I'd like to highlight. We have great relationships with customers. We have a lot of industry experience, and we have a highly motivated sales force that is truly value added.
Wow, what a low poop. I'd second the poop comment. Strengths are where we have superior performance or resources. Usually, we don't have either.
Okay, well, let's move on to weaknesses. We came up with 2.
37 strengths and 2 weaknesses. Yeah, that's about right.
Would you like me to go through the rest of the plan?
No. Just add some cool graphics and put it all into a 3-ring binder that we won't look at until this time next year.
And unfortunately, that might be humorous, but that's what a lot of people seem to do with their SWOT. They don't identify proper weaknesses. They don't really identify what their strengths are. And as for opportunities and threats, they confuse what's an internal opportunity to what an opportunity should be, something in an external environment. So SWOT also stands for subjective waffle with little original thought. And if it's not used to inform and drive strategy, then it's a substantial waste of time. So let's start thinking about examples of a typical SWOT. And I'm sure you've heard or seen, we are the industry standard. Does that mean that you're vulnerable to technology change? You've got a limited view of potential competition? Or is it actually real? And if you look at the Gartner Magic Quadrant, you're in the leadership segment. Then we have a full and comprehensive product range. That could be good, convenience, wide variety, and you can be a single source supplier. But it can also mean you've got a shallow assortment. Do you really understand what the customers want? And what's the cost of producing a very wide, comprehensive product range? Possibly if you were much more narrow, you'd do a lot better. If you look at the history of disruptive innovation, Clayton Christensen has a great case study on what he calls mini mills, where the big mill companies that did have a comprehensive product range, and they were knocked out of the water to sort of mini mills that were focusing on just one small area. And if you've not read any of Clayton Christensen's books, unfortunately he's passed away, so he's not going to write any more, but recommended for anybody involved in CI and is interested in the threats of disruption. And there's one of the key threats that you need to look at. And then another one, we are an old established company, and I'm sure you've heard that and seen that. Does that really mean that you're great, or is it you're just old-fashioned? So often strengths aren't strengths, they're weaknesses. So pitfalls when you're looking at your SWOT analysis, are you being subjective or are you being objective? How rigorous are you in your research, in your putting things down? Is your SWOT quantifiable? So can you compare it to other companies? Do you actually follow it up and use it in strategy, or do you just put it into a 3-ring binder with lots of pretty graphics and put it on the shelf till next year when you bring it down again? So does it link to your company and industry capabilities and resources? And as I said, do you confuse strengths, benefits, real opportunities, weaknesses, and real threats? So how should we do SWOT analysis? Well, first things to realize, SWOT analysis is a mix of internal analysis, looking at strengths and weaknesses. In other words, what your company can and can't do. And external information, the opportunities that you could take advantage of, the threats that could hurt you. And the aim is to establish a realistic starting point for objective setting and strategy development. So consider where and how to do the internal and external factors meet, and what can you do about it. And I said I'd talk about the difference between strengths, features, and benefits. A strength is something that a company possesses that can't easily be copied by competitors. If it can be copied, then it's not actually a strength, or it's certainly not a sustainable strength. A benefit is something that customers want, but it's not, and it might not be offered by other competitors, but it could be. So it doesn't convey a long-term advantage. And a feature is something that has no real benefit to customers. And if there's a cost involved in offering it, then it may even be a weakness. And a weakness is something that destroys your competitive advantage, leaves you open to external threats. I actually prefer the term vulnerability to weakness, because weaknesses aren't necessarily terminal, whereas a vulnerability means that you're going to get hurt. As an example, a poor location is often seen as a weakness, but you can turn it into strengths if, for instance, your rents and your costs are much lower than your competitors who are in sort of prestige locations. You could turn that weak location into something that you could turn into an advantage. And when we're talking about weaknesses, you've got structural weaknesses, which are basically problems with your long-term survival. They're weaknesses in core competencies. Then you've got symptomatic weaknesses, suggesting a deeper problem that needs to be addressed, but it may not be terminal. Poor morale, for instance, is a typical example of a weakness, but it's generally symptomatic of things that are much, much deeper. So identify what the problems actually are. We'll come to that in a second, what I mean by looking beyond the obvious. And then there's the hygiene weaknesses, problems that have potential to become serious if they're not addressed, but they're currently relatively minor. An example of a hygiene weakness is the lack of a CEO. The CEO's just moved to another company, or a senior exec. CEO's just resigned. It's a weakness because it allows competitors to gain advantage. But if you get a decent CEO afterwards, it's not really a long-term problem. But it could be a problem if you don't address it. So that's one of the things you need to look at management attention to sort of sort out. So understand how the sorts of weaknesses you've got and understand the sorts of strengths you've got can be important. So that's the starting point. But what are the issues you need to look at? And there's what I call the zone of comfortable debate, the zone of uncomfortable debate, and the core issues. The zone of comfortable debate says things like, we're losing sales to our competitors because our competitors are cheaper. People don't buy on price, they buy on satisfying your customer need. So rather than say we're losing sales to our competitor, that's comfortable. Nobody's going to disagree on that one. Instead, get to an uncomfortable debate. How is the competitor making profits by selling at a lower price? And you'll get all sorts of reasons. Oh, it's a loss leader. They've got a cheaper location. They've got cheaper overheads, or it's subsidized, all sorts of reasons, but you won't get universal agreement. But you still haven't got to the core issue. The core issue in this case is, how come we allowed the competitor to win one over on us by undercutting our product? So when you get to that, you're saying, well, what are we doing wrong that we're losing sales based on a cheaper product? Is it that the cheaper product satisfies customer needs, so they're not coming to us because why spend more on a product that's over-engineered? Or is it that your production is wrong? Is it that your machinery is wrong? You really have to look to see what's going on, and always look for the core issue. And to do that, you need to identify root causes. And there's a technique called cause analysis that can help you on that. So let's just take one example. Reputation. What goes to create a good reputation? Well, some of the things that will go to good reputation are a perception that you've got quality and a perception that you offer a good service. So now let's go down a level below that. What drives quality? What drives service? So possibly testing, and you make sure that your product doesn't have faults, Six Sigma, whatever you want to say, but you make sure you have decent quality. And when it comes to service, do you have people in the right places at the right time? Can they call you by phone, or is it a chat that doesn't work or doesn't even do that? Do they have the product knowledge to sort out your problems? If you've got decent product knowledge and a decent quality, you're going to get a good reputation. But what goes behind the testing and the service is training and experience. So train your people, train your engineers, and you'll get decent quality. People with experience, you'll get decent service. And behind all this, there's almost always a person. So ultimately, you're going back, who are the people you can't lose? So in this case, you might have a training manager. As a case example, many, many years ago, one of the UK banks felt that they wanted to get rid of all the old fogies, all the old people over about the age of 40, because there was a boom going on. And these people over the age of 40 were questioning, do you have the money to take out this loan? Can you pay it back? So loans weren't being given out. In a boom, you want to lend as much money as possible because you think you're going to get it back. So they made all these old fogies over 40 redundant. And a few years later, there was a recession. And all the young bloods in their 20s, 30s were still lending out money as if there was no tomorrow. And the bank was losing money from people from bad debts. And all of a sudden, they realized that these older people had been through a recession before. They knew what was going on. And they started to recruit them back. So ultimately, who are the people that matter? And that can lead to a decent reputation. It's not the quality, it's not the service, it's the people that make the quality and service. So always, if you think something's a strength, what's the root cause? If you think something's a weakness, what's the root cause? But there's a step further. Assess your capabilities. So there's 5 questions you need to answer. The first question is, where do we actually want to compete? What markets, what segments, what sectors do we want to compete in? Then ask, how can we gain competitive advantage in these segments or these areas? So what do we need to do to get competitive advantage? If you can't get competitive advantage, you're going to be losing out. You're not going to be making money. So to get competitive advantage, there are certain assets that are required. So what assets do you have? What assets do you need to get? So the assets that you currently have, and then if you don't have them, you have two options. You go back to say where to compete again, or how can we change to get those assets? So that's a slightly different approach to the traditional SWOT, because it's asking you a different question. It's not saying what are our strengths, but what do we need to do to compete in the markets we want to choose? And you can start mapping this essentially by saying, for every business, there are entry assets. If you don't have those entry assets, you're not going to be able to enter into that market. If you're already in that market and you don't have key entry assets, then you've got liabilities and you're going to lose out. So you can map your company's assets by saying, what do we need to do to be in the market in the first place? What do we need to do to get competitive advantage? So those are your strategic assets. But strategic assets over time diminish. So what's your future activity that's going to generate future strategic assets? As an example, strategic assets are things that aren't easy to copy. Things like technical know-how, your sort of tacit routines, how you do things, reputation, brand strength, the trust in your company, the cost of switching to another company, creativity. Look at Apple and its creativity, and that's one of the reasons it stayed around, even when they were having serious problems before the iPhone. Their creativity sort of, or before the iPod, brought them out. Contrast this with assets such as quality, which can be copied if it's not accompanied by reputation and brand strength. So you need the reputation and brand strength to protect the quality. And so you can look at the types of assets that are sort of tangible and system assets like basic operations, equipment, HR processes, equipment, market information, and the more hidden assets, which are much harder to copy. And those are the ones you want to develop. And obviously you want to avoid your liabilities, structural weaknesses, where there's a core entry asset that's missing or has declined. Then you've got symptomatic weaknesses suggesting there's the deeper problem. And as I mentioned, the hygiene weaknesses. So always try and assess what you need to do. And one thing you can do is you can actually look at what you can imagine and say, we want to enter this market now. What strengths do we need? What assets do we need to enter a market? And then you can say, if you're already in the market, what ones do we actually have that are giving us competitive advantage that are strategic assets? And if you've got something that you think you should have and it's missing, that's a liability. And what are you doing to build for the future? So we can go a step further. And you can start looking at these areas that you've just qualified. So the list of things that you need to be in the industry, the list of things you need to give you competitive advantage, and you can start ranking them. So you can say that if you're better than your competitors, better than the industry overall, and things are improving, that's a strength. If, on the other hand, relative to expected performance, relative to prior year performance and key competitors and the industry, you're much worse, that's a real weakness. So if it's a strength that's better than everybody else, then give yourself a 5. If it's worse than everybody else, give yourself a 1. If you're roughly the same, you get a 3. And if you're slightly better, a 4, and slightly worse, you get a 2. So you're not qualified. It's a qualitative measure, but it still allows you to rank how you're performing compared to competitors. So that initial thing of saying, oh, our strength, brand reputation. Well, compare yourself to competitors. If your competitors have a brand that's equally strong, then that's not really a strength. And if you think of companies like Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, both of them have extremely strong brands, which are much, much better than pretty much anybody else. And there are other cola brands and own brands. But how do they compare to each other? So their strengths compared to the industry, are they strengths compared to each other? And you can do that with pretty much any product or any service. But we can go a step further. And now we're getting to some of the other analysis techniques that you need to be aware of if you're going to do a proper SWOT analysis. And the first of these is Porter's 5 forces. So look at, sorry, not Porter's 5 forces, Porter's value chain, which he described in his second book. So the first book is Competitor Intelligence, and then you've got the Competitor Analysis. And if you've not read those, I thoroughly recommend them as basic CI texts. They should be on every CI practitioner's bookshelf. So start at the very beginning. What's the original source, the raw materials? How does that compare? And it doesn't matter what product or service you have, there's still some sort of raw material suppliers that are needed, how it's handled, whether it's data, whether it's a service, or whether it's a product. Then once you've looked at that, and how are you comparing on each of the various elements that make up that to the industry, you then go to the next stage, the manufacturing, the processing, the operations. And then how do you take the orders? What's the logistical process? And then how do you market and sell your products? What post marketing elements are there? What service elements are there? And then you've got the sort of underlying overheads within the business, so the technology, procurement, infrastructure, and of course there's the margin that comes out of this. So you can look at each of these elements and start saying, how do I compare to my competitors on each of those elements? So is your manufacturing more efficient or less efficient? Is your marketing better or worse? And compare that to the industry overall. The value chain is an old technique. It's still invaluable, so I still would recommend you sort of make sure you know this. I'm sort of half looking at questions as well, so I'm going to try and answer some questions if I can as we go along. I'm one of the questions, will I be sharing the deck? The answer is definitely yes on that. I'll give you a link at the end. There's an interesting question on SWOT analysis for the library info service within a company. And I'll try and show about the book I was talking about by Michael Porter, but I'll give there's another book that I'm going to mention as well, because I said that the value chain is an old technique. I think it's I think the book came out in probably 1985. There are some new tools that you can also use. And the first one is the business model canvas. The business model canvas is now, I think, 12 years old. And you can go to strategizer.com and get all sorts of information on how to do it. And essentially what the business model canvas says is there are 9 building blocks that every company has. The first one is their customer segments. So what are your customer segments? Who are they? So one of the things you would do here is say, okay, who, if we're looking at library information sector, who are our customers in the library information sector? Who comes to us? Who could come to us? What are we missing out? And then what are you offering those customers? So how are customer problems solved and satisfied? And again, you'd say, well, what are our strengths for each of these customer segments? How are we satisfying them with the value proposition? I'm going to come to the value propositions a bit more, because defining that initially might seem hard, but there's a technique for doing that. And then there's channels. So how are you reaching the customer? What are your sort of channels for getting to them? Is it, in a sense, what are your marketing approaches to get to your customers? What are your sales approaches? And then what's your relationships with each segment? And there may be different relationships for different segments. So if you're in the library world, you've got the people who know what they're looking for, and there might be something fairly trivial, or it could be something that could be in depth. So there can be different segments for each customer, and you have to, what's the customer relationships with each of those segments? That's on one side. So essentially that's, if we go back to, well, we'll go back in a second to the grid. You then have your key resources. So what do you need to do to get to satisfy those customers? So what are the things that you're producing? What are the things you're putting together? And the activities, how do you put those things together? And finally, the partnerships you need. So who are you working with outside? So that could be other companies, it could be joint venture partners, all sorts of people. And then below that, this is where the money goes in and the money goes out, is the revenue streams and the cost structure. When you're ranking your strengths and weaknesses, those are probably less important, because it's the other 7 blocks that lead to your revenue streams and your cost structure. So if you've got a good value proposition, supplying through decent channels, have great customer relationships, then you're going to have a good revenue stream. If your resources are adequate and you're not spending too much on it, and the activities into turning those into your services and products and your partnerships aren't too costly, then you're going to make money, because revenue stream minus cost structure is your profit margin. And this is how it's typically done. So you look at your value there are a number of ways of doing this, but the normal way is you look at your value proposition first, then you look at your customer segments first, and then your value proposition to each of those, and then in between you've got your customer relationships and your channels. So that's one side of the business marketing sales side, and that leads to the revenue streams. And then the key activities, key resources, key partners tend to be your costs. One of the problems with this model is that a lot of people don't know what the value proposition is. And this links to what's known as the value proposition canvas. And it's also from strategizer.com. Alex Osterwalder also created this because he realized that people weren't sure how to create a value proposition. So he thought, let's define it. And it's a bit more whimsical. You can find these in a more formal sense. So customer jobs. If you're a special librarian, what are the jobs that your customers want you to do? If you do those jobs for the customer, what are the gains they get? And they can be quite intangible gains. I did this for a client recently where we were looking at things like headaches. And one of the gains for a treatment for headaches is being able to work slightly better. And if you've got if you're, let's say, a migraine sufferer or certain other types of headache that are persistent, it can really impact your work, which could mean that you don't get a good appraisal, which means you don't get a salary rise. So one of the customer jobs of a headache cure is to make sure that you can work effectively. It's very intangible. And the pain would be, how big is the tablet? How long does it take to work? Are there any side effects? So from the customer's perspective, You have to identify what the jobs are that the customer wants to do, what the potential gains are if they achieve that, and what are the pains if they don't achieve that. So if we're looking at a library and the information sector, let's take, why is Google so successful? People use Google because they want to find information. And that's pretty much it. They don't go onto Google because they want to see an advertisement for something in particular. But if they see an advertisement that matches what they want to buy or what they're thinking of buying, a holiday or something like that, then they'll be happy. And if you look at all the various things that Google offers, it's all developed to provide information to the customer. So Google Flights, how can I find a cheap flight? How can I find what airlines go to places I want to go to? If I was in Athens now, wanting to go to Vilnius, and I was a Belarusian origin, my job will be slightly different to what it was a week ago. And I would use something like Google Flights to find routes that don't fly over Belarus, for instance. So the gain would be for an airline that does that. So, that would be the gain. The pain would be the price that I might have to pay to not fly over Belarus. So it doesn't matter what the situation is. There are always customer jobs you have to define. You always have to think what the potential gains are, what the pains are. And that's on the right side. And now we're getting to the SWOT bit and the analysis for the company. So a gain creator is something that allows your customer to get the gains they're looking for, which can be, as I said, not flying over Belarus or being able to go back to work because my headache's gone. A pain reliever is something that makes it easier, that doesn't actually, in the case of the headache, finding a small tablet that dissolves. So you've got two tablets. One of them's big, one of them's small. And they do exactly the same thing, and there's no real difference. So when you're looking at your value proposition, you've got to say what's the one that's got the small tablet has a strength over the one that's got the big tablet. Probably doesn't make much difference in the sense from a sustainable strength, because if the company identifies that that's a problem, it's not difficult to make small tablets rather than big tablets. So that's why I say strength versus benefits versus features. In this case, it's not really a strength to have a big tablet versus a small tablet, unless the manufacturing is completely different. And your products and services need to have lots of gain creators and lots of pain relievers. So again, what are those? So you're looking at things like that. And I'm just looking at some of the questions again.
Hi, Arthur. There are several questions that have come up. If I may summarize them quickly, there's a rather lengthy one from a lady, Helen Kula, who's an academic working in a business library who supports business students who are still taught they must generate a traditional SWOT analysis. And her question is that students often try to kickstart this process by using pre-packaged SWOT analysis from vendors such as Marketline or Global Data. And the question is, do you have any thoughts on this? And are there any which you might recommend? And then the second part of the question relates to your slide on the business model canvas, which originated, as you know, with startups and is now being used by larger companies. So if you might speak to either of those points, that would be amazing.
I'll start with the second one, because there's also something called the lean model canvas, which specifically addresses startups. And there are some slight differences. So for instance, if I go back to it, rather than customer segments, and which assumes you've already got the customer, it's looking at sort of the customers that you want to get and the value proposition. So you're looking there, instead of customer segments, is more things like early adopters. Value proposition is what are you producing? So there are differences between the lean model canvas and the business model canvas. The business model canvas very much goes for established businesses. The lean model canvas is much more for startups. In answer to Helen's question on package sources that I might recommend, there is one, if you're looking at competitive intelligence analysis, there is one book that, if you've not, I mentioned about Michael Porter's books, this book is probably even more important, and especially for business students. It's probably one of the best texts that is, and that's, and I've got to remember, I should go to my books and pull them off, but it's by Craig Fleischer, who I think is well known to a lot of people in SLA, and Babette Bensusan from Australia. They've got a number of books, but their first one, Strategic and Competitive Analysis, goes through pretty much every key analysis tool that you can think of. It doesn't cover yet the business model canvas, but I'm sure both of that and the value proposition canvas will be introduced at some later stage. Or in some later edition or update, but it does talk about SWOT, and there's a whole chapter on SWOT analysis. There's a whole chapter on pest analysis, which I'll come to in a second. The question.
We have another question about the nature of competition from Graham Goodwiller. And if I've understood the question, it's how do you define your competitors in terms of them being direct or indirect competitors, potential disruptors in adjacent industries?
Okay. When I'm comparing strengths, I'm essentially looking at my own industry. So if we go to Porter's 5 Forces, it's the industry analysis. Because if you're looking at disruptors, that's an external threat or possibly an external opportunity. So I'm going to come to that in a second anyway, because I've so far been focusing on the strengths and weaknesses. So you're ranking yourself against the existing companies that could steal your business. So they're offering the same sort of product to customer segment, the same sort of customer segments, and they will have value propositions that are going to be similar. It's much harder to do that. Just to give you an example, a theatre competes directly with a restaurant. The individual only has a certain amount of money or disposable income they can spend. So I'm going to go to the theatre and watch, or I'm going to go and watch a movie, or I can go out for a meal. And I'm spending maybe the same amount of money, but how does a cinema or theatre or movie theatre or a stage show compete with a restaurant? That's, to compare the two is kind of different. So you actually have to think, what am I going to do? And that's where the value proposition canvas comes in. So the customer job of, I want to go out and have a nice, entertaining evening with my partner, with my spouse. How you market that to that customer who wants that is where things come out. So you want to do a game creator will be, well, if you're going to the theatre, you can't talk to your spouse. You're going to be just watching, and it's something that's a very static type of entertainment. Whereas going for a meal, you can talk and you can chat. Playing a game of tennis is another form. So there are different ways that the customer will get satisfaction and achieve what they're trying to do, namely having a nice evening out with a loved one or somebody they'd like to have as a loved one. The gains are different, the pains are different. It could even be going for a long hike or long walk in the countryside. So that could give the same customer satisfaction without them even spending any money. And one technique to find what the gains and pains are is win-loss analysis. And I would always recommend win-loss analysis. Again, that's, I guess, for a future analysis toolkit, is these three techniques: the value proposition canvas, the business model canvas, and win-loss analysis. And win-loss analysis, you'll say, well, what are the, what do people, why am I losing customers? And that you get the disruption question as well, because if I'm losing customers to a disruptor, I want to know why. And this, you want to know why you're losing customers. So let's finish on, because I'm aware of the time. So what you're doing is you're creating a template, and you're looking at market share growth as one of your potential strengths. If your market share is going faster than your competitors, then that would be a 5. If it's much slower, it'd be 1. What market segments are addressed? What's your customer base? What's customer loyalty? What's the reputation? What's your promotional effectiveness? So in each of these, you're comparing these to a competitor. And you can do that, and you can then get, you can then sum them all up and give an average. You might weight them based on how important these are to you. And you can then compare yourself to competitors. So you might say, overall, what are we on our marketing? What are we on our operations? And you get a little map like this, and you can then compare yourself. And over time, you can compare yourself over a period of time. So you can say, what are we in 2021? What were we in 2020? How have things changed? How have we corrected things? And I said I'd come to opportunities and threats. And where are we in the industry? So this is where you have your disruptors who could be entering into our industry. So who are the potential substitutes for our service or product? What are the potential new entrants? And then, of course, there's buyer power, supplier power. What do they, what are people expecting from you? Who is who in relation to the firm in the industry? So before you even do a Porter's 5 Forces analysis, who are the stakeholders? Who's supporting you? Who's a real competitor? So who is a complementer? Who is a competitor? Using Brandenburger and Nailbuff's value map, which they outline in their book called Co-opetition. And that's another text that I thoroughly recommend. I ought to give a list. Sorry about that. I've got one of my phones on forward, but first of all, it was the mobile. And then my sort of home phone is just, that's one of the problems when you work from home. So one of the pains of working from home is you can get interrupted in the middle of a webinar. One of the gains is that I can go and make a cup of tea or coffee whenever I want, and I can have different cups of tea, and I can go out for walks. So there are pains and gains from working from home, which I think probably almost all of us have had to experience and find the benefits for. So stakeholder analysis, who is benefiting you? And then there's what's known as, I like to use the term pest, because they're things that annoy, but some people use the words pestle or steep. Pest stands for political factors, economic factors, socio-cultural factors, and technological factors. Pestle, you add in legal and environmental, and steep, get rid of the legal, but just put in environmental or ecological. But what you're essentially doing is saying, what is happening in the macro environment? And you need to look at all of these, and they all interact. So it's the macro environment that's being looked at here. And from there, you get your opportunities, you identify what the threats are. If you do a proper pest analysis, you should identify what the threats are, and also where the disruptions are likely to be coming from. And finally, what's the future? So again, what are the threats of disruptors? So you might do a scenario plan, wargaming, or Delphi technique, hence the picture in the background. So to finish off, and then I'll look through the questions again and any other questions and throw it completely open. I started off by saying SWOT is done badly. I'm trying to say that there are ways of quantifying your SWOT and making it a much more rigorous approach where you're not using a brainstorming approach, but you're actually trying to measure it against something that is measurable. It might be a qualitative measurement. It's very difficult to measure brand strength, although there are measures of brand strength, but you will know that your brand is stronger or weaker or the same as the competitor. So if it's much stronger, you might give it a 5. If you're working for a major library, who are your customers? How many books have you got? How many people have an MLIS or a relevant library degree? Can they help the customers, or are you talking about student librarians? So you can look at things like that, and you use your SWOT for planning. And SWOT, in a sense, is part of the situation analysis, one of the very first stages in business and marketing planning. Where are we now? Where do we want to go to? And then your strategies and your objectives come out of that. So use your SWOT to start off the process. How can we correct our strength? How can we build our strengths? How can we correct our weaknesses? What are the opportunities we need to take advantage of? What are the threats we need to protect against? And I'm not going to cover another model called the Towers Matrix, which looks at this very much sort of saying, well, threats linked to weaknesses. What do we need to correct? Strengths linked to opportunities. What do we need to take advantage of? So you're then using your knowledge to attack your competitor weaknesses. So you're going on the offenses and you're exploiting the best opportunities. And then, of course, the defensive side is the opposite of that, where you've highlighted threats to use the knowledge to head off the most serious attacks and prepare a counterattack. So we're almost at the top of the hour, and I'm just going to go back and look at some of the questions, if any, that I've not already answered.
After there's a killer question, Connie Pascal, how early in the innovation stroke startup process can you use SWOT analysis?
I'm going to turn that on its head because it's a great question. I've got a great new product and I want to raise venture capital. And I think it's a very innovative product that's going to make me a billionaire. The venture capital company doesn't care a damn about that. They want to know, are they going to get their money back? So if you haven't done a effective SWOT analysis of the industry that you're planning to serve, the customer base, so that's where the value proposition canvas comes in. So who are your customers going to be? How is your solution going to satisfy those customers? And why is your solution better than anybody else's? Are you reinventing the wheel, or are you inventing something that's completely different? So if you've not done a SWOT analysis at a very early stage, the chances of a venture capitalist coming in and investing in your product are going to be pretty low. You have to convince your investors that you have a product or service that's worth investing in. And to do that, you need to be able to compare your offering to any alternatives. And in this case, any alternatives could be traditional or other disruptors.
I think we've maybe got time for one last question. We have actually captured all of the questions and we'll be reaching out to you individually after the webinar.
Right. Okay, but I'm going to go just to, I'm going to switch out of this in a second, or actually you'll see my screen. If you could just hold on, I've been mentioning some books. So I'm just going to show you what they look like so you know when to buy them. And I'm not an advocate for Amazon, but in this case, you have to be. So That's 2. Where's the third one? Not find it. Sometimes you can't always find. Right. Well, this is. I don't know if this can be seen. Let's set the camera. Right. Set is back to front, or maybe it's not. It's business and competitive analysis, effective application of new and classic methods by Babette Van Susan and Craig Fleischer, and the little contents page, which I'm not going to be able to show. You've got competitive cash flow analysis, competitive positioning, business model analysis, critical success factors. So all sorts of more advanced models. It's Competitive Advantage, Michael Porter's book, and Alex Osterwalder's book, I think, is called Business Model Generation, by Alex Osterwalder. So if you just look any of those, and then there's Brandenburger and Nailbuff for competition, and if you're going to get those 4 books, you are going to wow pretty much anybody with your CI knowledge.
Great.
And one question I didn't answer was Stephanie Sheldon's on example of SWOT analysis for library information service within a company. I mean, that's very much of an internal thing. So again, you're doing the same sort of thing. So speak to your users and use the value proposition canvas to find out what they like about your service, what they don't like about your service. And if you're comparing it to library information services within other companies, then you speak to fellow librarians, speak to people at, within SLA to find out what they're doing that's different. So once you know what your customers want, identify, are they the same for other companies? And if not, maybe you're offering something that other companies aren't doing. Maybe you're offering things that they are doing. So again, you need to find that out. So SWOT analysis involves research, not brainstorming. Thank you very much. And I think we're at the top of the hour.
Thank you, Arthur. That was truly insightful. I'm sure everyone took away so much valuable information from that. To those who submitted your questions, we will get back to you. We've captured all of your important questions. I'm so sorry that we didn't manage to get around to every single one of you, but we definitely will follow up with you. Just to let you know that this has been recorded and probably towards the end of today will be available on the SLA CI YouTube channel, so you can share it from there. And also keep an eye on your email to see if you're the one lucky attendee who's won the $25 in the sweepstake. And with that, I would like to thank again our sponsors, Aurora, WD, Eric and Derek, and also Arthur for the infinite detail and understanding that he presented to us today in the webinar. Do come back for our next webinar, which you may remember is on June 30th. The next learning opportunity will be delving into insights on how to research venture capital. So I'm sure that will be a fascinating session as well. Thank you everyone so much, and hope to see you next month.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm just saying sort of some of the questions I missed. So you've got my email details. I would love to be able to answer some of those. And I'm very old school. It's got to be a really good tool for you to do a packaged, to do it properly. So I'm not a believer in packaged answers. Packaged, they're a bit like cereal boxes that have been set on the shelf for about 6 months. They taste a bit cruddy. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.